Okay, so thank you. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the many collaborators who've contributed to this work and ideas that I'm presenting in the seminar today from various institutions around the world. And I'm talking about Antarctic coasts. So Antarctic coasts are the interface between the ice sheet and land and the ocean. And as such, coastal ecosystems are really caught between the hammer and the anvil of the effects of environmental change occurring in both realms. And due to the variable nature of environmental change, some areas may be exposed to multiple impacts and multiple stresses and thus be extremely vulnerable to environmental changes. And coasts are also the nexus for most human activity in Antarctica. It's where stations are built and tourism is focused. So what is Antarctic coast and how is it distributed? Well, the Antarctic coastline is relatively long, but most of this is actually ice shelf or ice sheet. And because of the weight of the ice sheet, this depresses the coastline, and so most of the coast is actually very deep. And there's a fair amount of uncertainty in our knowledge of the distribution of shallow subtidal habitat. So where does shallow habitat actually exist, coastal habitat? So it's not easy to define. This is a summary of shallow areas according to the Icescape bathymetry, not necessarily just coastal, but also shallow areas. And the exposed area, which is areas not under ice shelves or glacier tongues, is around 280,000 square kilometres, best estimate. And we think the area that's less than 50 metres deep is somewhere around 25,000 square kilometres. And this is from some work done with Graham and Emma. So some coastal ecosystem features without too much detail. So shallow water habitats are relatively uncommon, probably fragmented, as most of the coast is deep, and so they're isolated, a bit like islands. Coastal areas have very high biodiversity, most of which resides in benthic habitats. And there's also important trophic links to pelagic and offshore systems, and also to higher predators like seals and penguins. So there is a bit of a paucity of info on biodiversity, and many areas of the coast are poorly sampled. And as I mentioned, stations and tourism are actually concentrated in these areas. So coastal marine communities, which are the focus of my research, are in many ways typical of what you might find in other regions, with a range of things like seaweeds and marine invertebrates that look pretty much like those anywhere else, with the exception of being endemic to Antarctica, of course. However, there also exist communities unlike those found anywhere else on Earth outside polar regions, and particularly under ice communities, as Graham's already mentioned, which tend to be dominated by marine invertebrates and are extremely variable, and even today are presenting us with some surprises. For example, this is a polychaete reef, which was found in Ellis Fjord in the mid-80s, but was only recently re-observed last year for the first time since then. And evidence suggests that it's the largest contiguous polychaete worm reef in the world, and certainly in Antarctica. And its existence is the result of a unique combination of several environmental conditions. And like a coral reef, this worm reef supports a diverse community of epifauna, animals living in and among the reef structure, in some places in incredible densities. And as we explore new areas, who knows what other unique or special communities we might discover. And for me, this is one of the most exciting prospects of the SAEF SRI, the potential opportunity to visit some out-of-the-way places that have never been sampled before. So coastal areas face a range of environmental changes to key processes and drivers that are likely to cause change in coastal ecosystems. I'm not discussing all of these today, but I'm going to focus on a few of the key drivers. And these can be split into global climate changes affecting Antarctica and local ones. Globally, we have things like changes in sea ice and ocean acidification. And locally, we have things like pollution and continuing development of the coast, potential introductions of non-native species, and maybe in the future we'll see resource extraction. Who knows? So an important strategic goal for the Australian Antarctic Division is to understand the impacts of local human activities. And this has been a large focus of my research over the past 20 years or so. Some of this work has been descriptive in nature, sampling disturbed and control areas, but it's also included field experiments examining responses of benthic communities to a range of environmental drivers. For example, this has included work on the effects of oil and fuel spilled in coastal ecosystems, which is a surprisingly common occurrence. Hydrocarbons actually represent one of the biggest risks to the environment posed by Antarctic stations. We've also done some of the most comprehensive work on the effects of sewage and wastewater outfalls in Antarctica. And in fact, sewage disposal is a good example of how the Madrid Protocol, or the environmental protocol to the treaty, can be ineffective at preventing environmental impacts, largely due to vague or poorly defined annexes or them simply just being too weak. So this impact assessment work has led to the accumulation of long-term data sets on benthic biodiversity at a range of control and impacted sites around Casey and Davis stations. And this will be very useful in assessing both long-term responses to human impacts, as well as long-term change driven by other processes such as climate. So moving to some of these globally driven climate environmental changes, starting with ice. Ice is a major driver of ecosystem processes in Antarctic coastal areas. And ice influences things like light in the water column, primary production, seawater temperature, and physical disturbance of the seabed. And we know that sea ice is decreasing in some areas. Here we can see an average decrease of around 3 months a year and increasing in other areas. And this is highly variable, particularly in coastal regions. So there's also large regional variation in sea ice cover. Here we see 4 different sectors which have quite different sea ice duration properties. The Atlantic and East Pacific sectors have areas that are permanently open or mostly open water, whereas the entirety of the Indian and West Pacific sectors are ice covered for at least half the year. So ice is actually very complex in coastal areas. It's not just sea ice, but a range of closely coupled glacial and sea ice elements. And this has been termed the Icescape. And these elements interact on regional scales to affect local ecosystems. This makes it quite difficult to predict how they will change in future. An example of these local scale patterns of ice duration come from East Antarctica. And this is trends in sea ice duration, changes in sea ice duration between 1980 and 2010. And you can see it's highly variable on local scales. For example, around Davis, we see a decrease in sea ice duration, and just over the road at Mawson, an increase. So this makes it very complex and difficult to predict future changes. But what do changes in sea ice actually mean for coastal ecosystems? Well, one effect is that sea ice moderates ice scour by icebergs. Ice scour is an important process of physical disturbance in benthic ecosystems. This is an example from Rothera that shows what kind of effects that can have. You can see a decline in sea ice duration resulting in more open water, and this top right graph here as well. And this has resulted in an increase in ice scour frequency in shallow water habitats. The result of that ice scour increase is a decrease in benthic growth in shallow water, but an increase in benthic growth in deeper water because of the fact of less sea ice and more light. So we see less carbon sequestered in shallows and more in deep water. This is actually a process that's been termed blue carbon, and largely the work of David Barnes and colleagues at BAS. And they estimate that blue carbon in cold regions is regionally and globally very important. So biological growth draws down carbon to the seabed and stabilises it and sequesters it in sediments. And this ecosystem service varies spatially and temporally. But unlike terrestrial forests, much of it is permanently buried in sediments. Some blue carbon projections, again from David Barnes, show that it's increasing in some areas, which is actually a negative climate change feedback, but decreasing in other areas, which is a positive feedback. But overall, he thinks it's increasing. So another effect of sea ice on shallow benthic communities is via changes in light reaching the seabed, and Graham's already touched on this. So benthic communities under ice for most of the year are dominated by marine invertebrates, where in more open waters, seaweed is dominant. And there seems to be a tipping point where a certain level of light is reached, that you get a shift from one type of community to the other. And as Graham has pointed out, there's already been changes in the amount of light reaching the water column. The modelling indicates that there could potentially be very large non-linear increases, particularly in coastal regions. So I just wanted to highlight the effect in coasts, which will occur from changes in sea ice. Changes in sea ice will also affect the accessibility of the coast, potentially opening up access to new parts of the coast, both for people as well as for wildlife. And glacial retreat is a phenomenon which is restricted to coastal regions, and it causes a variety of environmental changes, including to sedimentation, freshening, generates more icebergs, increases fjord-type habitats. And nearly 90% of the glaciers on the West Antarctic Peninsula are now in retreat, and the rate of retreat is actually increasing. So this has impacts on coastal biodiversity. There'll also be increased freshening of coastal waters from increased melt, as not only glaciers retreat, but from the melting ice sheet. And this can lead to changes in seawater chemistry, productivity, and ultimately might result in changes in planktonic communities with flow-on effects to the benthos. But these changes will be quite variable and much stronger in some areas than others, as this modelling work by Jasmine Lee and co-workers has shown. Ocean acidification. Well, pH is changing more rapidly in polar regions and other areas of the globe. And carbonate levels are actually predicted to be seasonally undersaturated in coastal waters within the next few decades, and potentially permanently undersaturated in surface waters by the end of the century under business as usual emissions. So polar ecosystems are likely to be among the first to be affected by ocean acidification. But we know relatively little about the spatial and temporal variation in carbonate cycles in coastal habitats. So this is another area where we've done some experimental work, manipulating carbon dioxide concentrations in chambers on the seabed and examining community responses. So these are the chambers we installed, and here you can see the change we exerted on pH. So this is pH in experimental chambers, the acidified chambers compared to the control chambers and ambient conditions. We also know that Southern Ocean winds are changing. There's been a poleward contraction of, and strengthening of westerlies, and modelling indicates that this is likely to have a range of effects in coastal areas, such as more turbulence, in currents and waves, potentially leading to more ice breakout, decreases in water clarity, and a range of other effects. So how might some of these changes actually directly affect biota? Well, we know that many Antarctic organisms have narrow physiological tolerance ranges to things like temperature and salinity, and that these are changing. So temperature's increasing, salinity's decreasing, so they're likely to be facing multiple stresses. We know many organisms have slow metabolism, slow development and growth. They can be long-lived with long generation times, and many seem to have a brooding reproductive mode, which limits dispersal ability. So we have many geographically isolated populations and species, and cryptic speciation going on. And these traits all act to potentially increase the sensitivity of Antarctic biota to environmental change. So some of the key questions for coastal ecosystem research in the SRI include assessments of what we know now in terms of habitats and physical changes that are occurring. So we can identify the important gaps in things like bathymetry and habitat mapping and biodiversity gaps. And ultimately, it'd be good to be able to make predictions for models and other estimates about where change is going to occur for some of these major drivers, so that we can identify areas where multiple stresses are likely to be occurring. And we need to do this at a range of scales, from regionalised right down to smaller scales. And to make such predictions, we need a better understanding of the spatial and temporal variation in some of the physical and chemical parameters in coastal areas, such as the carbonate system. We need to address some of the biodiversity gaps by expanding to unexplored areas. And all this would be aided by development of a better understanding of oceanographic processes and variation in coastal areas. Because the global climate and oceanographic models are not particularly good at localised scales, so perhaps we need more development of some regional oceanographic models. So how might science in coastal ecosystems contribute to policy and management? Well, we know there's an increasing desire within the Antarctic Treaty System to take a more holistic and systematic approach to area protection. So identifying important or representative or vulnerable areas can directly inform decision making within the CEP and other ATS forums. However, there are some problems with some of these guidelines and wording and definitions contained within the environmental protocol. So can these be improved to improve environmental management? So Antarctic coastal ecosystems are an important component of the wider Antarctic ecosystem. Generally poorly sampled and not well understood. And the coast is going to change. It's changing now. And this change is complex with respect to spatial and temporal scales. And this creates a lot of complexity and difficulties with predicting future changes. People are concentrated on the coast, and I think our environmental management and protection of the coast can be improved. And this work, I think coastal work really feeds well into all of the 3 SAFE themes. So I'd be very interested to hear from anyone else who's interested in this kind of work and would like to be involved. Thank you.